All right, good afternoon. It's 12 o'clock and it's Wednesday, so it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University. Iowa Learning Farms is a partnership of the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the Iowa DNR, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, Iowa NRCS, and many other partners. Really fortunate to have with us today Ashley Dean. Ashley is an extension specialist in field crop entomology at Iowa State University, and she's going to talk to us about corn earworm challenges in sweet corn. Nobody can say that the Iowa Learning Farms webinar series doesn't have variety. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Ashley today about the corn earworm challenges. So with that, Ashley, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I think this is maybe a little bit of a different topic than what your webinar series is used to hearing. So hopefully this is useful to some folks in the group and maybe provide some new information that they haven't heard before. So it never failed. Okay, there we go. Um, I I won't go over again what the title is, but I did want to acknowledge also Dr. Erin Hodson, who is an extension entomologist at Iowa State. She helped put together this presentation, but also did a lot of the field collections that I'll talk about later in the presentation. So I wanted to acknowledge her as well for this presentation. So our goals for today are to understand identification and life cycle for corn earworm and recognize injury specifically to corn that this pest is capable of. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to scout for corn earworm, what to look for, and we'll kind of end with investigating management options and some of the new challenges that are happening with corn earworms, particularly in sweet corn. So to start off with, just like any other moth or butterfly, corn earworm goes through complete metamorphosis. So they have these four distinct life stages. So it goes from an adult that lays an egg, that egg hatches, and then they go through 5 to 8 larval instars before they pupate, which is the fourth and final life stage, before they turn into an adult again. So one entire cycle is called a generation, and that takes about 5 weeks in Iowa to complete. So from adult all the way to adult, that takes about 5 weeks in Iowa, depending on temperature. Something that is interesting about corn earworm is they really can't handle the cold temperatures that happen above the 40th parallel. So they most often do not overwinter in Iowa, which means that they're overwintering south of that 40th parallel. So particularly they're coming up from the south. So they come in with storms throughout the spring and summer. And then they'll have 1 to 2 generations in Iowa. So that means that they'll go through that life cycle that we just talked about at least one time, probably 2 times during the summer here in Iowa. So they have a variety of host plants. You've probably heard a few other common names for this pest. Um, uh, they can be found on many wild and cultivated hosts like corn, cotton, soybeans, and tomatoes. And primarily the reason that we care so much about them is because they really focus on the reproductive tissues. So they do have a strong preference for corn, which means that they are focusing on the ear. And when we're talking about something like sweet corn, I primarily work in field corn where we do see corn earworm, but we don't really think about them too much because we're not eating those ears. But when we think about sweet corn, this can be a really, really big deal because nobody really wants to bite into an ear that potentially has a caterpillar in it, right? So they're attracted to those ears, particularly the adults will try to find green silks to lay those eggs on. And then once those eggs hatch, they will feed on those green silks all the way down into the tip of the ear. And usually they stay there. And I'll show you some pictures of injury here pretty soon. But um, primarily we see them on the ear tip, but they may move down into the ear. So when we think about like economic losses for corn earworm, um, it's really hard to measure like in bushels per acre how much loss is happening. And especially when it's at the ear tip, it probably isn't that much when we think about like dollars per acre, bushels per acre, but it does cause aesthetic injury. If you're eating that ear of corn, that can just be kind of gross and put some people off. So we really don't want to see this injury in a crop where we are actually consuming um, those reproductive tissues. So mostly it's aesthetic injury, but it is very important when we think about the hosts that they are eating. Another thing is that feeding at the tip of the ear can be a way for pathogens to enter the ear. And so sometimes we can get a lot of molds that are developing right there at the ear tip that could potentially extend down the ear as well. So scouting for corn earworm, you can definitely look for caterpillars, and it's pretty easy to find caterpillars when they're in the ear. Like I said, I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. But what is most important is monitoring moth flights. So our goal is to detect the very first moth that comes into a trap in the spring, kind of early summer. So since they are coming from the south, it takes some time for them to get here. And I think usually we can start to see them in June, but it may not be unheard of to start to see them in May. So if you wanted to put up some traps to monitor moth flights, I would say probably try to put those up in May and then check them regularly throughout the rest of the summer. Especially if you are growing sweet corn commercially, it's really important to be tracking those over time. So we use these female pheromone traps, particularly the one on the right, the white mesh trap, is the one that would be accessible and affordable to most people. Um, you can use this trap. Basically, it's like a funnel. Those moths kind of gather at the bottom when they are attracted to a pheromone that's placed down there, and then they kind of go up and get caught in the top part. And so it's pretty easy to look for them in those traps. You want to place it near a cornfield, check it pretty regularly, like 2 to 3 times a week, and then replace those pheromone lures every 2 to 3 weeks to keep them fresh so that you know that you're attracting those moths. So the adults, there are a lot of little brown moths out in the world, and it can be kind of hard to distinguish them from each other. Corn earworm moths can be variable in body color and wing color. But one thing that is pretty obvious is this dark spot on the forewing. There are some other things that may have that, but I think if you're actually using those traps and using the pheromones, most of what you're going to catch in those traps are corn earworm adults. But you do want to make sure because there are other things that could end up in those traps. So you're looking for a little brown moth about 1.5 inches wingspan with a dark spot on the forewings, the wings closest to the head. Um, and there are some more pictures in a different handout, which I included in the PDF that is in the chat box. So another thing that you could look for in the field are corn earworm eggs. Once those adults arrive, they lay eggs on green silks. And so you can pretty readily see these if they are on corn silks. They are laid as single eggs and they're pale green to pale yellow. They look pretty white when compared to a corn silk. And over about a week, they'll mature and then hatch after that. And then those caterpillars pretty quickly move down into the ear. A single female can lay 500 to 3,000 eggs, which is pretty phenomenal. And that's why insects can be very, very successful. The larvae are the larva is the life stage that's actually doing the injury to corn. So that's probably what would be pretty important to identify as well if you are actually opening ears trying to look for things that are feeding inside. So there's a lot of different caterpillars that could be present in a corn ear, but a corn earworm would have a kind of like golden brown orangish head capsule. And then these light and dark lines down the back of the caterpillar. The body color, though, can be really variable. So you can see this picture here of some caterpillars that I pulled out of a field a few years ago. These all came from the same field. I'm not sure why they can be so variable in color, but you can see they can be green, yellow, brown, purple, all kinds of colors. So you want to look for that head capsule color. And also these black spots that are all over the body that will have hair sticking out of them. Um, they will also have 4 pairs of prolegs. So when I talk about prolegs, I'm talking about these kind of fleshy legs toward the rear of the caterpillar. That can be a way to help distinguish different caterpillars that you might be seeing in a corn ear. They get pretty big. They will be about 2 inches when they're fully developed. Um, and that could also help you kind of identify different caterpillars as well. So this is kind of what that injury looks like that I've been talking about. Um, Usually this is kind of concentrated at the ear tip. But sometimes if they're following those silk channels down, they can kind of end up toward the middle of the ear as well. Or if they're done feeding at the ear tip, they can kind of move down into the rest of the ear as well. Another thing that you might see is called frass. And quite simply, this is just insect poop. So um, it's pretty gross, and corn earworm in particular probably has some of the most disgusting frass, but it kind of looks oatmeal-y, and kind of it is usually kind of around that caterpillar. So sometimes people notice that first, and then they'll see the caterpillar. Um, Another fun fact is that corn earworm larvae are actually cannibalistic. So they'll sort of fight to the death when they're in an ear together, and usually there's only one left. Unlike this picture that's in the middle there, where there's 2 pretty large size corn earworms, that's not something that you'll typically see with this pest. So, kind of moving on to integrated pest management, or IPM. Hopefully, this is a term that is not totally new to most people in the group, but it is something that I just wanted to review for when we talk about management options later in the presentation. Another concept that I'll introduce is insecticide resistance management. And this is sort of a component of integrated pest management. We kind of do these things together to try to keep our management tactics as useful as possible for the longest amount of time. So there are a lot of components of a successful integrated pest management program, or IPM program. I think people often think about the management tactics, which are the things kind of at the top here. So things like, host plant resistance, natural enemies, pesticides, those are all certainly a very important part of IPM, but something that like entomologists and other scientists really focus on when we're developing an IPM program are these things at the bottom. And so that's sort of why I went through, the life cycle of a corn earworm identification, how to look for corn earworms, because that all plays into a successful integrated pest management program. We really have to understand how these insects behave, how they move in the environment, and how to identify them so that we can effectively sample and then manage those pests. So the other concept, IRM, insecticide resistance management, is exactly like it sounds, right? We want to try to preserve these technologies as long as possible. So some general guidelines for that is we want to use effective high dose active ingredients. And if we're talking about like an insecticide, we want, excuse me, we want to use uh, the full rate of those insecticide active ingredients. Sometimes people ask about, cutting them in half if that would save some money, but really the best thing for preventing resistance is to make sure that we're using high doses. Some other things to think about are to alternate modes of action when we're trying to manage a pest. So we can think of all the different things that we have available, right? Like host plant resistance, maybe BT hybrids, insecticides. Um, there are also natural enemies out in the environment that we would like to preserve as much as possible because in most years they can do a really good job managing most of the insect pests that we have. So alternating those things when possible is a really good practice for resistance management. Maybe one of the most important things is just to limit exposures because anytime that we use an insecticide or BT or any management practice, anytime that we use something like that is a chance for insects to overcome that management strategy. So if we can alternate them and use them sparingly, only when we really, really need them, that'll help keep them effective for longer. Additionally, we want to provide a refuge in the landscape. So that would just be an untreated area where we didn't use that management tactic to help us generate some insects that are hopefully susceptible to that tactic to go on to mate with ones that might be resistant and kind of dilute that resistance in the population. So there's a ton more information on insecticide resistance management. Um, all across the internet, but the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee has a really nice animation on that as well. So specifically talking about corn earworm, there are a few different uh, there are a few different strategies that people employ, especially when we're thinking about like using insecticides for sweet corn. Um, a really common approach is what we would refer to as a prophylactic approach, where starting like pretty much right at silking, people are spraying every 2 to 5 days, depending on maybe the weather populations that they're seeing, that sort of thing. They'll spray every 2 to 5 days. Throughout the silking period. And when we think about sweet corn, usually people have these successive plantings to keep sweet corn available all season long. And so there can be a lot of sprays on a particular farm for corn earworm and other pests that might be feeding on that crop. Um, Alternative to that, we have the integrated pest management approach, the IPM approach, which would involve regular scouting, um, either for caterpillars or for the moths. I didn't mention it earlier, but the reason that we want to target the moths for our scouting is because once those caterpillars kind of get down that silk channel and into the ear, we have a really, really hard time managing them with insecticides because they are in that protective structure. And so, um, if we can, if we need to apply an insecticide, we want to target the eggs, and then hopefully there's some insecticide there as they start to hatch that comes in contact with those caterpillars before they enter the ear. So regular scouting, especially for the moths. And then alternating insecticide modes of action is really important in the IPM approach. Um, and then if it's possible, we would encourage people to incorporate BT, specifically the VIP proteins, if it's acceptable to consumers. I realize that with sweet corn, there probably are some markets that having a BT protein planted would not be acceptable, but that could be another way just to kind of break up the different management strategies that are being used for one pest. So if it is something that's interesting, or if it interests you to try to use a BT protein to help manage corn earworm, or maybe some other pests that might be troublesome in your sweet corn production, there is something called the Handy BT Trait Table that is updated usually every year for field corn, less often for sweet corn, but it can kind of help you see what hybrids are available and also what pests would be controlled by those different proteins. So when we're thinking about that IPM-based spray schedule, that this is sort of what that would look like in conjunction with scouting by trapping for moths. So this is data from Virginia Tech, where they kind of compared the IPM approach to a prophylactic approach. And this is sort of the table they came up with for an IPM approach. So you can see that we're looking at moths per day or moths per week. So this would be kind of an average of how long it has been since you checked the traps. And then it'll help you identify an appropriate spray interval based on how many moths are kind of moving in your area and likely laying eggs in that cornfield. So this research found that the IPM approach usually averaged about 2 to 5 sprays per season, while the prophylactic approach averaged 6 to 7 sprays per season. So not only can we limit the amount of insecticides that we're using, but also probably saving quite a bit of money by using the IPM approach if we only have to spray 2 to 5 times per season rather than 6 or 7. I won't go into great detail on this just in the interest of time, but some considerations if you need to spray for corn earworm or really any insect in corn. Particularly for corn earworm, we want to try to spray the silks so that we know that those insecticides are getting into contact with the eggs and then the really small larvae that are hatching and moving through the silks to the corn ear. It's probably best for, targeting the silks to use a sprayer with drop nozzles. In general, we want to use high volume and pressure to get small droplets that will infiltrate the canopy and come into contact with those insects because almost everything we have is based on contacting or being ingested by those insects. So we don't have very many insecticides that would be a systemic option. Another important thing, right, is to rotate insecticide groups. So there's a couple examples there of some pretty common rotations that people use. And then if you want to see how well that's working, you can always use water-sensitive paper. So kind of the meat of this, where we're kind of building up to, right, is a status update on corn earworm in Iowa. Probably the most common chemistry that's been used for corn earworm and most other insects at this point are pyrethroids. And resistance to pyrethroids have been noted in corn earworm for a really, really long time, particularly in the South and the Southeast, where corn earworm is feeding on a lot of their major crops, right? Corn, cotton, soybeans, and tobacco. It'll feed on all of those things. And if they're using insecticides in all of those areas, resistance can develop pretty quickly. So this is not really a new thing because we have been seeing this kind of declining performance in sweet corn around the United States. But this resistance that has been noted for a really long time is kind of a target site mutation for pyrethroids called the voltage-gated sodium channel. So it's a specific type of mutation that after a lot of exposures, this target site kind of modifies, and then the insect can overcome that insecticide when it is exposed to it. What has happened more recently is that there's kind of a new mutation being confirmed, particularly in Colorado, and then most recently in Iowa. I think maybe also in Texas, this has been confirmed. So there are still ongoing field collections happening. So well, I should say not we, Aaron and also Brad Coates with the USDA have been collecting some corn earworms from fields in Iowa in 2025. So we hope to have updated results soon. But what has been happening is there's kind of a new mechanism of resistance that's happening for pyrethroids. And so it's a cytochrome P450 gene that has been described in Old World bullworm, which is kind of a sister species of corn earworm. And so these two species have kind of hybridized, and this is one of those genes that got transferred to corn earworm. And what's interesting about it is that it's not a target site mutation. Um, what happens with this gene is more of a metabolic resistance. So they can essentially break down the insecticide when they are exposed to it, rendering it ineffective, even without being exposed to it. So this is kind of what that collection process looked like. They went out and gathered some ears, looked for corn earworms, brought them back to the lab, and then Brad Coates is the one who sequenced or who did the genetic testing on those caterpillars to see if they had this gene that that they were seeing in Colorado. So in this would have been last summer, 2024, they visited two commercial farms in July, and they found that one farm had 100% of the caterpillars that they tested had this mutation or had this gene present. And then the other field had 57% of those corn earworms had that gene that confers resistance to pyrethroids. And what was most interesting is the field that had 57% of the larvae had that gene. They had not even been exposed to pyrethroids in 2024. So had that farmer tried to spray a pyrethroid, it may not have worked for a majority of the caterpillars that were present in the field. So, to kind of leave you with a plan, if you are a sweet corn producer, if it's acceptable to your consumers and to yourself, consider using a BT or at least kind of rotating it in every now and then to try to break up this spraying of pyrethroids. Specifically, the trait that we would be looking for to use is the VIP3A trait, which is it isn't present in every single BT hybrid that's out there, but this is the one that's considered to be still effective for corn earworm because on top of being resistant to pyrethroids, they have also overcome many of the BT traits in corn. And the ones that are used in field corn are very similar to the ones that are much the same as the ones that are being used in sweet corn. So try to look for a hybrid that has that VIP3A trait if you would like to use a BT trait. Plan to trap for moths and then scout for injury regularly, and use that IPM spray table to help you get an idea of a schedule for spraying. Make sure to apply full rates so that if that chemistry will work on corn earworm, we have a really good chance of killing it if we use full rates. Target sprays to silks if you can, if you have access to drop nozzles and can do that. And then alternate insecticide groups so that we're not using a pyrethroid every single time we spray in a year. And I think that's all I have. So that was kind of a quick update on this, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I've also put Erin's contact information here. If you'd like more information, maybe about the collections that were done. And if you happen to grow sweet corn and you are interested in having us come collect some corn earworms from your field, let us know that as well. We're always looking to try to beef up this data that we have for this new gene.
All right. Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks so much, Ashley.
Yeah.
Super interesting. All right. So if you watch this webinar live and want to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, ALENAW at iastate.edu. We can go to the next slide,
Okay.
which should be if you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate that. You can scan the QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org /survey. Again, only one survey response is needed for all 2025 webinars. So if you've done so, thank you very much. And if you're willing to, we'd greatly appreciate it. Next slide. Okay, we have Madeline Westenberg that's going to talk to us about climate tools for ag decision making next week. She's the agricultural climatology extension specialist here at Iowa State University. So feel free, please tune in and please send information about this webinar to people you think might be interested. And on that note, next slide. All our webinars are archived, and so you can go to iowalearningfarms.org/webinars or to the YouTube channel specifically dedicated to webinars for the Iowa Learning Farm. So go there if you want to watch an archived webinar. And this one, as long as the recording works, should be up there shortly. So we did get a couple questions, Ashley. One was, what implications have you seen on the general food chain issues that would be caused due to the further influence of diminishing those earworms? Or, yeah, I guess that's the first one. What implications have you seen on the general food chain issues that would be caused due to the further influence of diminishing these earworms?
Hmm. Um, I guess I don't necessarily work with commercial sweet corn growers, but if I'm understanding that right, like would corn earworms becoming resistant to pyrethroids,
Yeah,
would that have like, further effects on the food chain? Um, uh, I assume we mean like for like consumers, right?
yeah, yeah,
Humans. Okay. So I would I would guess that it would have a lot more impact on like direct markets, right? So like farmers markets, foods, the sweet corn stands
yeah,
all around the state. Um, I've heard a lot of stories of, particularly last year, I heard a lot of stories of some of the larger operations. They would have to open up ears before they gave them to consumers, break
yeah,
off the part that has corn earworm in them, and then, offer a reduced price
yeah,
for getting, half an ear or a third or two-thirds of an ear. And so I'm not sure, like, beyond the sort of local scale, how that might be, how we might be impacting the food chain that way. But certainly, people who are directly selling to consumers are seeing an effect of this when they are spraying for corn earworms and not being able to control them. They have to either adjust pricing for those, or people might just walk away as well if there
yeah,
are a lot of corn earworms in those ears.
yeah. Yeah, speaking from experience, I hated when I'd rip open that husk and find that earworm in there. Oh my gosh.
It's
Yeah,
not appetizing.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, few more here. Are there any population species that prey on these earthworms or moths that could be affected by reducing them?
Uh, so yes, there are corn earworms have quite a few natural enemies. I would say as moths and also as larvae. Um, Most commonly for both, actually, birds really like moths and larvae. But usually, if we have birds trying to consume corn earworm larvae, they're also doing some damage to ears. So it's it's kind of, um, but there are also some insects that would prey on the larvae in particular. Um, and if we are using insecticides for corn earworm control, most certainly those are also impacting any insects that would be feeding on or that would be trying to control corn earworm as well. So that's one of the reasons that, like within the IPM approach, we say to use insecticides sparingly because we do have a lot of natural enemies that are out there, and those would be just as impacted by most of the chemistries that we have as the pest that we're trying to control.
Okay. So in the last few years, we've seen kind of a range of dry conditions or extremely wet. Um, do drought conditions or wet conditions impact the prevalence of corn earworms?
Mm, that is an excellent question. I don't know specifically, like
Okay.
if there has been research done on that. I can maybe provide some um, anecdotes.
Okay.
So we had a few dry years recently where I would say I still saw quite a few corn earworms and definitely heard of a lot of corn earworm issues in those years, even though they were particularly dry. So I don't necessarily think that there would be an impact on that. But the other thing to consider is they are moving in usually with wind and storms from the south. And so if we have wet weather, particularly coming from like
Oh, yeah.
southerly winds,
Mm.
we would also be seeing corn earworms. So my impression, without
Mhm.
knowing for sure if there's a scientific research-based answer, my impression is I don't think that they're too impacted by wet or dry conditions, but I'm saying that with the caveat that I don't know for sure.
Okay, no worries. Um, a few more here. So, how does the high volume help? Does it get insecticide below the top corn plant leaves? And would 15 gallons per acre still be helpful?
Mm. So the first part of the question, yes, the high volume and pressure is meant to get get that insecticide
Okay.
where it needs to be in the canopy, right? So that's kind of like a for insecticides in particular, we really need those small droplet sizes. Um, so that's why we pretty much blanket recommend high volume, high pressure for insecticides. Um, as for like the carrier volume, what would be sufficient? That is not my area of expertise, but it's not uncommon to, I think it's not uncommon to use 15 gallons per acre.
Yep.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Has the C okay, this has the CYP337B3 gene only found in corn earworm feeding sweet corn in Iowa or field corn as well?
Mm. I don't know that we've tested corn earworms that we have taken out of field corn, but the corn earworms that would infest field corn are not different than the ones that would
Okay.
infest sweet corn, right? So
Okay.
I would assume if we did find a large population of corn earworms that we could test in Iowa field corn, I assume we would see a similar thing.
Okay. Um, so we're getting toward the end of the question. So if somebody still has one, please type in. But otherwise, what percent? Okay, so this one, what percentage of corn farmers are using IPM, do you think? And for the farmers who aren't using IPM, what are their main concerns or hesitations or barriers?
Oh, that is an excellent question, and I don't know that I have an answer.
Okay.
I don't know like a percentage of farmers that are using IPM. Um, I would say that more often I hear about people who have like a spray schedule, like a calendar-based spraying, or if they're already out to spray a fungicide, then they might throw in an insecticide. And these are just really common things that are happening across the landscape. But I think that most people do consider IPM and are trying their best to incorporate some IPM practices on their farm. And so even if people are spraying, I often hear them say, well, I sprayed a pyrethroid. And so if I need to spray again, I'm going to use something different.
Okay.
Um, so I think people are definitely thinking about it and trying to do their best for resistance management and pest management. Um, as for like barriers to adoption of
Mhm.
IPM, I'm not really sure. Uh,
Okay.
Perhaps we need a wide survey on that.
Yeah. Okay. Um, okay. Here. Any suggestions for organic certified products that work?
Um, I tried to look this up earlier
Okay.
because that is a question that we get a lot. So obviously BT would not, or BT hybrids would not be useful for organic, but there are um, formulated products that you can spray that would be organic. And so I think I'm looking at, I included a foliar insecticides for corn earworm. I
Okay.
don't know, you probably
I'll,
can't see this, but it's in the PDF handout.
I'm going to put
Um,
that PDF again one
yeah,
more
so
time. So
things like Pyganic, which is uh, which is a natural version of like the pyrethroids that I was talking about, is an organic option, but I I don't I shouldn't speak on this, but I'm wondering how that would work if we see pyrethroid resistance to the synthetic ones that we've tested. So um, that is an organic option. And then I think, is it Entrust is another organic option that's pretty common. Yes, Entrust. So there are a couple options. Um, and they tend to be pretty good if the timing for those applications are if they're well-timed applications. Yep.
all right, I think that's the questions. Put the PDF in the chat box. Elena noted that if you click on it, it'll likely download it right away. So you can look on your computer um, in your download folder, maybe there. Um, we can hopefully put a link to that in the blog when that comes out next week, the blog summary, webinar blog summary. Um, Ashley, thank you so much for the presentation. Um, Please tune in next week to hear Madeline talk about some of the decision tools related to climate. And with that, I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Thanks so very much.
Thanks.